Hi, my name's Peter Addy. I'm a psychotherapist here in Portland, Oregon, and before that, I used to be an associate research scientist at Yale School of Medicine. I studied atypical psychedelic substances for several years. I have a lot of research and clinical experience with spiritual and transpersonal states from drugs and not from drugs. And so here I am in private practice, and people come up to me sometimes and they'll say, Dr. Addy, I'm really interested in taking a psychedelic substance and having that experience. I've read the studies. I'm really interested in some healing there. Can you help me with that? And I say, no, I can't help you with that. Most of the time, taking psychedelics is illegal. And as a therapist, I mean, any therapist that you talk to, our number one concern is safety and reducing risks. Any therapist, we think about risks and risk management every day. And that could be as simple as there's a risk that your confidential information is going to leave the room. So we manage that risk by closing the door, using a white noise machine. I use encrypted file systems on my computer. So we think about risks all day. And so if someone comes to me and says, I want to use a psychedelic substance, that's very risky for the client. That's illegal, and my licensing boards would not be happy if I were condoning drug use or the use of any kind of illegal behavior. But it's also risky for the client. I mean, taking psychedelics could be harmful. It could be risky. And by far, the number one risk or concern is that it's illegal, it's against the law, and these are federally controlled Schedule I substances. Going to jail or prison is not conducive to anyone's mental health. So I'm not going to recommend or advise anyone to do anything illegal because I'm trying to reduce risk, and doing something illegal and possibly going to jail is very risky and unhealthy. And that's kind of disappointing for people who come to me for help. They want healing, they're suffering, and they want to suffer less. And I don't want to just say, nope, I can't help, and that's it. So through many years of research, I've figured out a few legal ways that people might be able to take psychedelic substances. I'm gonna say this many times. I'm not a lawyer. So I'm talking about legal, lawyerly things, but I'm not a lawyer. So if you or anyone is interested in, seriously interested in any of these approaches, maybe you could consult a lawyer. The Oregon Bar Association has a lawyer referral service. I've used it. It's really good. Other states have similar services. Or you could just kind of talk to people that you know. As a therapist, I'm licensed in Oregon and Washington, and I love talking to my clients about risks and reducing risks. So if you're in one of those states, I'm happy to talk with you. But I've found that there are 4 legal ways that someone can take a psychedelic substance, and I'm going to have an honorable mention of a kind of a 5th way. So 4, maybe 5 ways that someone can legally take psychedelics. Not to say that I'm recommending or that these are good ideas, but these are options that might be available to you. So let's see. Number 1 is the most obvious one is to join a research study. That's what I used to do. There's a lot of popular press, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD. There's a lot of really cool phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials going on in the world, and in this country in particular. So that's really great because you know that you know what you're going to take. There's a known potency and purity. These things have been lab tested. There's a known procedure, safety guidelines, medical doctors standing by just in case. It's legally protected. These studies are FDA and DEA approved, so no one's going to get in trouble. So that's really good. It's easy to find them. You can go to clinicaltrials.gov. Any researcher in the country that is researching something with human beings has their trial on clinicaltrials.gov. And many European trials also register here. The European Union has their own clinical trial database, but a lot of people put it in both. So, and you're required to update the, to put updates on there. I think it's every 6 months, it might be every 12, I forgot, but these, it's up to date. So you can search by keyword psilocybin, and you can filter by state, by, the age or gender or conditions of the people that they're looking for. So you can find, here's a study of psilocybin for smoking cessation, and here's one for MDMA to help with post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. It's all there, easily accessible, and they have contact information. So you can see who's doing the study, who you can call or email to learn more, or maybe get in the door. One thing I found is that there's usually more than one contact person listed. One of them is the principal investigator. They probably have an MD after their name, or maybe a PhD. Don't talk to them. They are way too busy. The next person on the list maybe doesn't have any letters after their name, or maybe like a BA. That's the research coordinator. That's the person you want to talk to. Their job literally is to get you in the door to do a study. They are the ones who do all the heavy lifting. The PIs get all the fame, but the research coordinators are the ones who do all the hard work on the ground. So that's the person you want to talk to. So call, email, see if you can get in, if you can meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that's really easy. It's publicly available. You just make a phone call and you can learn more about it. But there's also some downsides there, that it could be far away. None of these trials are happening in Oregon. Northern California is the closest here. A lot of the work's on the East Coast, not all of it, but it might just not be around. Or even if it is, maybe you don't meet the criteria. These research trials are very rigorous in who they take, so you just might not be eligible. There's also the issue of integration. I think a lot about integration work, which is just that if you go over there, so if you fly to South Carolina to do an MDMA assisted psychotherapy study, and then you have amazing experiences, and then you go back home to Portland, you might not have a community, you might not have people you can talk to for support. And that's hard, forget about psychedelics. If you just go off for like a 7-day meditation retreat or something like that, and then you come back home and no one else in your circle knows about meditation retreats. You just, you can't talk about your experiences to anyone, and it's really tough. It's hard to keep those insights with you afterwards. So the study itself, while you're in that 6-month rigorous period, there's a ton of integration work. It's the best. But then afterwards, maybe you don't have so much. So pros and cons to going to a clinical research study. Maybe that's not available, or it's not interesting to you for one reason or another. So there's a second option available if you legally want to take a psychedelic drug, and that's to become a tourist. So there's a lot of ayahuasca tourism. This is probably a $1 billion industry, and to a lesser extent mushroom and ibogaine tourism, but it's mostly ayahuasca tourism, whereby you go to South America or sometimes Central America, where ayahuasca is legally protected. It's culturally acceptable and to use ayahuasca in a ritual way, and you can go there and you can just have that experience. Ayahuasca tourism has some pluses and some minuses, like all of the other approaches here. The first one is that, it's not really easily accessible. So I did a little bit of research online, and an all-inclusive 9-day ayahuasca retreat on average costs about $1,500, plus airfare, plus time off work, plus immunizations if you're going to a different area. It's weird that this is a controversial thing to say, but I am pro-immunizations. And vaccines are great, and if you're from the United States and you're going to the Amazon basin, you probably need some of those. All of these things cost money, so this is not accessible to a lot of people. A recent study said that ayahuasca tourists are primarily white, urban, relatively wealthy, well-educated, spiritually eclectic outsiders. The experience takes place outside of the context of a long-term involvement with the struggles of the indigenous community from which the shaman comes. And this brings up 2 points. One is shamanism. We talk a lot about ayahuasca shamanism. Shamanism comes from Mongolia and Siberia. That is what the indigenous people of that region do. A long time ago, some white people came to the Amazon and said, "You guys are shamans," but they're not shamans. A better terms to use might be curandero, ayahuasquero, or onanias. So the curanderos or the ayahuasqueros, they have their own traditions, and these traditions have historically been appropriated and persecuted by the white man. And so here we are, white people from the United States, going into Brazil or Ecuador and taking something useful for us and then leaving, which, we've been doing that for hundreds of years, and it's caused a lot of violence and poverty and bad things to happen. So there's a struggle that the indigenous people are going through. And if you want to be an ayahuasca tourist, are you helping with that struggle, or are you making that struggle worse? Are you perpetuating it? It's a question to ask. Let's see here. Unlike a research study, if you go drink some ayahuasca with a healer, you don't necessarily know what's in it. There's no known potency or purity, partly because that's a Western concept that doesn't really translate to a lot of these indigenous contexts, but also just in terms of we can think about what plants go in the drink, right? Ayahuasca definitely contains a leaf with DMT and a vine with beta-carbolines like harmine, both of which are psychoactive substances in their own right, both of which have been used in psychotherapy in their time. But sometimes ayahuasqueros add other substances like tobacco leaves, non-psychoactive plants, datura, which can cause delirium, other things. And that could be because the plant spirits and the indigenous healing traditions call for that to happen. Sometimes that's because the healer says, I got to give these white people the real bang for their buck, so I'm going to throw some datura in the mix tonight, so they give me a good review on Yelp. And, so not to say that that's bad, but just you might not know. If you only want to drink those 2 plants, and then you go down there and you drink a beverage with 5 plants, if you know about that ahead of time, if you have consent, that's fine. But maybe you don't know about it, and then that could be confusing, and that could lead to unpleasant experiences. It's also worth noting that sexual assault is prevalent in ayahuasca tourism. All genders are perpetrators, and all genders are victims or survivors, but the pattern tends to be an indigenous man who's the facilitator or the at this point I can't say healer, but the person in charge of things picks out and assaults a white or a non-indigenous woman. Again, it's not always that way. To be clear, sexual assault is always the responsibility of the perpetrator. Again, I don't know why that's a controversial thing to say, but it is. So it is always the fault of the perpetrator. That being said, there are other factors or additional factors that can be involved. There's a lot of cross-cultural miscommunication where the foreigners look at the indigenous people and say, well, they must be more elevated, they must be more advanced than I am because they do this every day. They must. There's an implicit trust sometimes, which can be abused. On the other side, the indigenous people often look at white women, particularly American women, and think that they're more desirable than indigenous women and that they're more promiscuous because that's what advertising and TV tells them. So there's some expectations that can be taken advantage of. And so there's a lot of sexual assault that goes on, and often if that happens in the Amazon and then you come back to your home base, you might be blamed for it. So not only is there no integration, but there's victim blaming, and it can traumatize or re-traumatize you. I'll mention that so the Chacruna Institute recently came out with some community guidelines for both reducing, reporting, and supporting people who have experienced sexual assault in ayahuasca retreats. So they're a very good organization, very helpful in this realm. In the Portland area, I know the Portland Psychedelic Equity Project. Yeah, the Portland Psychedelic Equity Project has women-only support groups specifically, and you can talk to other people in a safe place about any kinds of experiences that you may have had. So there's definitely some pros to ayahuasca tourism, but there are also some cons or some risks. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but as a therapist, I'm very concerned with risks and the management of risks. So there are risks. Let's see here. There's also sometimes you can go to an ayahuasca retreat center and they help the indigenous community. All proceeds go to schools, roads, infrastructure, livestock, things like that. And going to some retreat centers is very helpful and supportive of the local community. Other times you go to an ayahuasca retreat center and very little of that goes back to the local community, and that just repeats the cycle of victimization and exploitation of indigenous resources by foreigners. So I'm not saying that it's always like that, but sometimes it's exploitative to be an ayahuasca tourist. So finding the ethical, responsible places is definitely worth your time. So maybe you don't want to travel. There's a third way that you might be able to legally experience psychedelics, and that's to join a church. So right here in the United States of America, there are 3 recognized legal psychedelic churches. In 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was codified, and that exempted the Native American church. They use peyote as a religious sacrament, and their church is a bona fide religious institution, and there's no prosecutions, there should be no arrests for anyone in that church. Later on, it was clarified that you, in fact, do not have to be Native American yourself to be a member and participate in the Native American church. So it is, in theory, open to anyone. More recently, in 2006, the U.S. Supreme Court found that the UDV, which is a Brazilian ayahuasca church, is, again, it's a bona fide church. They use ayahuasca as a religious sacrament. It's not a drug in that context, and you can legally participate in that church. More recently and more locally, in 2009, the U.S. District Court of Oregon found that a different ayahuasca church, Santo Daime, is a church with a legit legal religious sacrament of ayahuasca. So these 3 churches have legal protections, in theory. So we talk about risks and risk management. So there's court precedent saying don't prosecute these churches on a state or federal level, but that doesn't mean that there's no discrimination from the local community, local sheriffs, people who might not approve of psychedelic churches. I know that that's happened here in Oregon in the past. So while these things might be legal, there might still be discrimination. The people in these churches aren't exactly advertising. You know, they don't want to proselytize. They're not going door to door trying to make converts. They want to keep it kind of quiet so that no one bothers them, really. If you want to join one of these churches, why? Why do you want to do that? Do you want to have a psychedelic experience because that's like a cool thing to do that you're kind of interested in? Because if so, similar issues of cultural appropriation. You're going into this community which has historically been disadvantaged and prosecuted. You want to take something cool for yourself because it's interesting, or for your own personal healing, and then you leave again. It's not really what church is about. I grew up Lutheran, and I learned from a very early age that the word church is related to a group of people. It's not a building. It's people gathered together for a common purpose, the purpose of glorifying God, or whatever that purpose is. So an ayahuasca church or peyote church, same way. You're joining a group of people, and we're all healing each other in that context. So for you to just go in, get your healing, and leave again, that's really antithetical to the point of an ayahuasca church, of a community, of a circle. So there's also, so I don't know very much about the Native American church. I'm more familiar with the UDV and Santo Daime, the ayahuasca churches. And both of them are at least partly based on or influenced by Catholicism. And so they are very hierarchical and they are very gendered. And sometimes, particularly the ones in Brazil, less so the ones in the United States, they can have rather unfriendly attitudes towards LGBTQIA, etc. folks. So these are very gendered. So I know in Santo Daime and UDV, men dress in one way and sit in one half of the room, women dress a different way, sit in the other half of the room, and they do not communicate with each other unless absolutely necessary. And so if you're non-binary or intersex or trans, where do you sit? That could be very uncomfortable for you and possibly other people around you. If you're gay and you go to a Santo Daime service where people talk about the gay lifestyle as a sin that is in need of healing, then that's going to be uncomfortable, possibly traumatic. If you're going to one of these churches in order to seek healing from gender or sexual-based trauma, and that happens, that could re-traumatize you. So some of these churches don't do that. You know, I'm not saying, again, this isn't a blanket statement. Every church is, every physical branch of the church is a little bit different based on local customs and whatnot. So some of them are very accepting, and there can be a lot of really nice people there. But you don't know unless you ask and get to know them and get to know the community. Because again, this isn't like going on a retreat for a week. This is, these people, you know, they live there. This is their lives. This is what they do. So just be mindful if you want to just walk in there and join them. So you could maybe join a research study. You can travel outside the country. You can join a church. I also encourage people to kind of expand their definition or rethink what psychedelic even means. So I'm popularizing the term atypical psychedelic. So this is pretty common in psychiatry. So we talk about typical antipsychotics, work on dopamine. Atypical antipsychotics might work on glutamate or something else. Typical antidepressants work on serotonin. Atypical antidepressants work on norepinephrine, dopamine sometimes. So same way. A classical or a typical psychedelic substance is a 5-HT2A agonist. Very clearly, strictly defined. And I've gotten in a number of heated discussions over the years at conferences about that definition being, in my opinion, too narrow. But that's the way that people use the word. So I'm using a different term, an atypical psychedelic, which causes or can cause a psychedelic experience, but is not a serotonin 2A agonist. A lot of my research has been on salvia divinorum, which is kappa-opioid receptor agonist. We also have ketamine and dextromethorphan, which are largely NMDA antagonists. Dextromethorphan also has some activity on sigma and PCP receptors, maybe at high doses. Even something like MDMA or ibogaine that are serotonin agonists, they also do other stuff. They're not purely, strictly serotonin agonists. Even cannabis, which has its own very tricky legal status. Under the right set and setting and dosage, cannabis can produce or facilitate psychedelic experiences. So if you just want to change your perception a little about what the term psychedelic substance means, there might be a lot of options available to you. I know that there are psychedelic ketamine and psychedelic cannabis clinics in Colorado and I think Seattle. I don't know of any in Portland or other places. Something like salvia, that's legally available in some states but not others, so always check your local regulations. But these might be available to you legally. You could just buy them online or at a head shop or something like that. But there's risk to that as well. Sometimes you don't know what you're getting because there's no known potency or purity. There's no testing for salvia products, something like that. you don't know what to do with it in the same way. Like there's less of a history, there's less of a culture or a container of like what to do. There might, if you're doing something on your own versus as part of a group where there's a trained, experienced facilitator, that's a very different context. So you might be able to just rethink what a psychedelic substance is, but then you have to think about how are you going to use it, how is it available, who are you going to do it with, all these things. So that has its pros and its cons. So these are 4 different ways that you can take a psychedelic substance and have a psychedelic experience, which some people in some contexts find to be healing and very beneficial. I'm gonna, one honorary mention, there are a number of non-drug ways to have a psychedelic experience. A lot of my clinical training, I studied non-ordinary or transpersonal states that can be facilitated by meditation, yoga, martial arts, restricted environmental stimulation, which is sometimes called sensory deprivation. There are a lot of ways that, many more than the ones I listed. Those are the ones that I've personally studied or know a little about. But that's a whole topic in and of itself. I'm just going to mention one, which is holotropic breathwork. And I mention that because one of the first LSD researchers, Stanislav Grof, he studied LSD for 20 years, first in what was at the time Czechoslovakia, later in Maryland. He knew basically everything there was to know about LSD psychotherapy back in the day. That program was finally shut down in the early 70s, so he and his wife Christina came up with a new approach. They saw LSD psychotherapy as extremely beneficial. It is helpful to so many people who are suffering, and now we can't do that anymore. So what can we do legally? The same question that I've been asking myself. Clients come to me, or potential clients come to me, and they say, I want to experience psychedelics for healing. And I say, well, that's illegal. Can't help you with that. Stan Grof had the same question. So he came up with his own system. He came up with holotropic breathwork. And that is a way, there's no drugs involved. It's just a series of breathing exercises, evocative music, some somatic approaches in a group format. And he says, you can get to the same places that you could get with LSD. You can do it just by breathing. And he's been doing this for decades. He's been doing this for like 40 years now, far longer than he ever did the LSD research. And he's really honed it down to a science. And so this was created specifically because LSD was no longer available. So holotropic breathwork is definitely worth checking out. Again, I don't know of any groups in Portland who are doing it, but there is one in Seattle. I know about that, and there's several on the East Coast. I don't know, all the details, but you can find it online. So that might be an option. That too, if you're traveling, you might not have a community in your hometown that you can talk about these experiences with. So the integration piece is still possibly lacking. Or it's key for any of these approaches. You need to be able to integrate, you need to be able to talk to someone afterwards, because it could be hard. It could be really great, but either way, you need to be able to process it and talk about it for weeks or months afterwards. This is not a one and done deal. So holotropic breathwork, as an honorary mention, these are some ways that you can have psychedelic experiences, possibly with psychedelic drugs legally. Again, I'm not advising anyone to do that. Anytime you just go to a therapist for any reason, if you say like, I need some advice about something, I want to go talk to a therapist, you're going to be disappointed. Therapists don't really do advice. That's not in our wheelhouse. So I don't advise people. I'm not going to recommend that you do this versus that. But I love talking about risks and risk management and harm reduction. I do that every day. So if anyone's in Oregon and Washington and you want to talk to me personally about risk management and the pros and cons of psychedelic experiences, I'm available. I'm happy to chat. If you live in another state, there are other resources available. There are a few lists you can find. So you can definitely find someone to talk to just have informed consent, to have informed decision making about what you want to do, why you want to do it, and what some of the risks are. So these are a few options that might be available to you if you choose to learn more about them. And you can always contact me or someone else to learn more.